Case study: Ellen Street Estates Ltd versus Minister of Health. Introduction. The 1934 case of Ellen Street Estates Ltd versus Minister of Health stands as a landmark decision in English law. It serves as a cornerstone for understanding the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and its impact on the interpretation of subsequent legislation. The case centered on a dispute between a property owner and the government regarding compulsory acquisition and compensation rights. Factual background. The Housing Act of 1921 empowered local authorities to acquire properties deemed unfit for habitation, paving the way for slum clearance. In 1921, Mr. Lytham purchased several properties on Ellen Street, London, which were earmarked for demolition under this act. The local authority passed a resolution for compulsory acquisition, triggering expectations for compensation under the Acquisition of Land Assessment of Compensation Act 1919. However, demolition plans were delayed for several years. By the time the local authority was ready to proceed, the initial compulsory acquisition resolution had expired. This presented a legal dilemma. The local authority opted to issue a new resolution under the Housing Act 1930, a more recent statute. However, a crucial difference existed. The compensation provisions of the 1930 Act differed from those of the ALA 1919, potentially resulting in lower compensation for Mr. Lytham's properties. Legal issue. This discrepancy in compensation formed the central legal question in the case. The crux of the matter was whether the Housing Act 1930 later legislation implicitly repealed the compensation provisions established in the ALA 1919 earlier legislation. Mr. Lytham argued that the earlier act provided him with a vested right to compensation under its terms, and the later act could not supersede it. Holding and reasoning. The Court of Appeal ultimately sided with the Minister of Health representing the local authority. Their decision hinged on the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. This principle establishes Parliament as the supreme lawmaking body in the United Kingdom, with the ultimate authority to enact and amend legislation. The court reasoned that a later Parliament could, through new legislation, override provisions in earlier acts, even without explicitly stating an intention to repeal them. In essence, the newer Housing Act 1930, by virtue of being a later statute, established the current legal framework for compensation in such cases. The court's decision effectively disregarded Mr. Lytham's reliance on the earlier Act's provisions. Impact. The decision in Ellen Street Estates Ltd v Minister of Health had a significant impact on English legal interpretation. It firmly established the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and its implications for navigating seemingly conflicting statutes. Here are some key takeaways. Unfettered power to enact laws. The case underscores Parliament's unfettered power to enact new laws that may supersede prior legislation. This highlights the dynamic nature of the legal landscape, where later acts can alter the legal framework established by earlier ones. Statutory interpretation in context. The decision emphasizes the importance of interpreting legislation based on the current legal framework established by Parliament. Courts will consider the most recent statutes in effect when determining legal rights and obligations. Limitations on property rights. The case potentially raises concerns about the impact on property rights and expectations of compensation. Mr. Lytham's argument regarding his vested right to compensation under the earlier Act was disregarded. This highlights the potential vulnerability of property rights when faced with subsequent legislation. Conclusion. Street Estates Ltd versus Minister of Health serves as a crucial case in understanding the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and its implications for statutory interpretation. It establishes Parliament's supreme law-making authority and the dynamic nature of the legal framework based on subsequent legislation. While this case bolsters parliamentary power, it also potentially creates tension with the concept of fairness, particularly when dealing with vested rights and legitimate expectations. If you are a law student and looking for more case studies, visit our website www.mylawtutor.net.